Dear friends of the family, we live in strange times. An ideology has captured the Western world that denies the basic fact of human existence, the fact that a human being is either man or woman and cannot change his or her sex. For statements like this, people lose their jobs and are persecuted in many nations by new laws of discrimination and hate speech. If the anthropological foundation of human existence is destabilized, the social edifice of human life breaks down: marriage and family and procreation. The Western world suffers the consequences: demographic decline, the breakdown of marriage and family, the abandonment of the young generation, making them mentally and physically sick. Let us ask, who is man? Man is the only living being who not only exists, but knows that he exists. He knows that he was born and must die, and therefore asks where he comes from and where he is going. He asks about the meaning of his existence and the meaning of the world which he perceives with his 5 senses. In response to this question, people have developed religions that have shaped people's cultures and epochs. The marvelous culture of the Western world is formed by Christianity, and of course Judaism and the Greek culture behind it. The Bible reveals God as the creator of the world and as the creator of man. He created man out of love in his own image and calls him to communion with himself in eternal life. Man should rejoice at this message, but he does not. Why not? Because God makes ethical demands. If God is love and calls man to eternal communion with himself, then man must learn in this life to answer God's love with his own love. He does not want to be dependent on God, not even on his mercy. The spirit of rebellion against God is the inner core of the Gnostic worldview. Man does not want to accept any objective limitations to his freedom. He wants to invent his own identity by himself. The satisfaction of limitless desires becomes the meaning of life. This appears to the individual who considers himself autonomous as freedom, but it is the freedom of an orphan who has lost his roots in God, in his own nature, in nation, in family. It delivers him to that which is more powerful than his will, his own desires and the desires of those who have more power than himself. The body is seen as limitation to the freedom of the self-willed mind. This Gnostic rebellion is taken to extremes by contemporary gender theory. Stripped of all transcendence, it is the philosophical and practical attempt to abolish the binary creation of man and woman and to surrender man to the arbitrary self-definition of his identity. The autonomous, autocratic individual does not respect the dignity of the person as unity of body, soul, and spirit, nor the limitations of his freedom in the created world, which is given to man for responsible stewardship. This leads to the exploitation of man and nature and tends to build a totalitarian society. Modern Gnosticism manifests in 3 areas. 1, idolatry of sexuality. 2, gender ideology. 3, transformation of human rights founded in natural law into arbitrary individual rights. Let's look at the first point, idolatry of sexuality. The sexual liberation proclaimed and practiced in 1968 by rebellious students and their teachers Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor W. Adorno, Alfred Kinsey, John Money, Simone de Beauvoir, and others, meant the tearing down of all moral norms of sexuality. The intellectual trailblazers of the sexual revolution were atheists, communists, anarchistic thinkers, and they still are. If one looks at the personal life of these powerful thinkers, one usually finds an abyss of so-called liberated sexual practices. However, so-called sexual liberation did not lead to a domination-free paradise of the pleasure principle, as Herbert Marcuse had prophesied in his book of 1955 with the title Eros and Civilization, but rather to an idolization of sexuality. Idols have the property of devouring their worshippers in the long run. While man attempts to subjugate his body and exploit it as a means of sexual lust, the sexualized body becomes an idol that subjugates the will of the person through a chronic dissatisfaction with one's body and through sexual addiction. This paves the way into an abyss of perversion. The sexual drive takes on a life of its own and becomes a tyrannical ruler, and man becomes a slave to his sexual drive. An addicted person loses the option to adapt to the conditions of creation, above all to the unchangeable fact of being born as man or woman, called to cooperate with the Creator to give life. In this affliction, intellectuals use the power of their intellect to adapt the world to their own sexual appetites instead of adapting themselves to the order of creation by striving for virtue. This lifestyle is sold to the world as good under the false flags of freedom, women liberation, tolerance, equality, equity, anti-discrimination, and human rights. Why their ideas so rapidly found support from the powerful of this world in politics and the uncontrolled empires of money and big tech remains to be analyzed by historians of the culture of death. The ultimate exertion of power over the body is the self-determined termination of life. Man cannot decide his birth, but he can decide to end his own life and the life of those weaker than himself, the unborn, the aged, the sick, and the suffering. The natural consequence of the sexual act is procreation. A sexualized society cannot do without contraception and abortion. Through the step-by-step legalization of contraception and abortion, the mentality of sex yes, baby no has seized modern society. Meanwhile, leftist parties and politicians are calling for the legalization of killing the unborn child until birth. Under our eyes, Christianity is turning into barbarism. The obvious devastating consequences of the sexual revolution are destruction of marriage and family, steep increase in divorce rates, and thus in the number of abandoned children, global contamination with pornography, mass sexual abuse of children, rapid increase in homosexuality among young people, the crash of the birth rate. In one word, the revolution eats its children. It should be obvious to everyone. If man wants to find happiness instead of fleeting sexual satisfaction, the sexual drive must be educated by striving for the virtue of chastity, so that it serves the heart's longing for love and the participation in the creation of man. but man, entangled in sin, cannot see the obvious. Theologian Romano Guardini put it succinctly, quote, according to the logic of evil, sin produces delusion, delusion produces more sin, and sin produces more delusion. The second point, gender ideology. Human beings come into the world as either male or female, irrespective of natural disorders. This is understood by gender ideology as a limitation of individual freedom. Those who cannot do and do not want to fit into the so-called heterosexual normativity experience the binary structure of sex as discriminating and unacceptable. They claim the autonomy of the individual over the body and the satisfaction of sexual preferences as their human right. Judith Butler, US philosopher of nihilistic deconstructionism and avowed lesbian, published the book with the title Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity in 1990. The title states the agenda to subvert identity. She claims that there is no binary structure of the sexes and that gender, defined as social sex, is independent of biological sex. There is, according to gender ideology, so-called gender fluidity, a fluid, continuous transition between male and female, in which everyone can arbitrarily define his or her identity at will, according to his or her sexual proclivities. Facebook offers some 60 sexual identities to choose from. For Judith Butler, the body is not a reality, but a fictional construction which is determined by the language of domination of patriarchal society. Thus, nature and reason and truth are thrown overboard as criteria of anthropology and law. The intellectual violence of this theory manifests in the suppression of freedom of speech, because every contradiction unmasks the lie and the liar. Democracy cannot exist without the freedom of speech. No one could have imagined in 1990 that this reality-denying theory would infiltrate and change society from the universities down to kindergarten and to codify it in law. In 2017, Germany's Federal Constitutional Court introduced a diverse third gender. Employers now must advertise vacancies as male, female, and diverse. Although since that law was passed, only 350 people have made use. The acronym for the sexual revolution was LGBT, for lesbian, gay, bi, and trans, expanded by Q for any sexual appetite that is not covered by lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual lifestyles. The letter I for intersexuality does not really belong here, because intersexuality is not a choice, but a very rare biological abnormality of sexual organs. Strategically, the transgender movement followed the triumphant success of the homosexual movement. At the very day after the decision of the US Supreme Court to legalize same-sex marriage, that was June 26 of 2015, President Obama initiated the bathroom battle, demanding the right of gender-confused children to use the bathrooms of the sex of their choice in schools. Now, in the US and elsewhere, men who proclaim that they are women can take part in women's sports competitions and are detained in women wards in case of criminality. This has created a schism between the feminist movement and the transgender movement. Because the body is seen as material and not as a meaningful expression of the person, a person can feel in the wrong body. He or she can no longer experience himself or herself as a unity of body, mind, and soul. Instead of getting to the bottom of this personality split with therapeutic help, violence is done to the body by the intake of hormones or even surgical mutilation. Yet, biological sex cannot be changed, since every cell of the body of a woman has XX chromosomes and every cell of the body of a man has XY chromosomes. The number of those who want to change their gender has exploded in recent years, especially among pubescent girls. The fact that numerous states allow underage adolescents by law to damage their lives irreversibly, making them infertile, prone to very serious illnesses and lifelong dependency on the intake of hormones, is a grave offense against the young generation, and no doubt will be judged by history as an inconceivable wrong. Third point, the transformation of natural human rights into arbitrary individual rights. The sexual revolution could only be enforced by discrediting the Christian anthropology on which the legal system of the once Christian societies was based. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 was inspired by Christian anthropology. Man was seen as a being of flesh and blood created by God, endowed with spirit, and called to strive to live in harmony with God, with creation, and with his fellow human beings. The concept of human rights was associated with the hope that a repetition of the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi and communist dictatorships could be averted through an international commitment to the inviolable dignity of the human person. More than 70 years have passed since then. In that time, the idea of human rights has undergone a fundamental transformation. Human rights are no longer a codification of the natural rights that belong to every human being at all times, but they focus on the rights of the individual without reference to nature, without reference to the common good. This has given rise to unnatural rights, which ignore the nature of man and no longer accept anything as given in order to live in harmony with himself and his social and natural environment. These unnatural rights include the killing of the unborn human being, the killing of the suffering human being through euthanasia, the selection of the human being through eugenics, the arbitrary redefinition of marriage by opening it up to same-sex couples, the denial of the human right of the child to its biological father and mother by artificial reproduction and surrogate motherhood, the choice of sex by means of juridical attribution, the recognition of the phantasm of a third sex, the sacrilegious transgressions of the order of creation by transhuman experiments of interbreeding of man and machine and man and animal, where neither God nor nature nor the common good give orientation to a society, and only the arbitrary rights of the individual are valid, then man becomes a wolf to man, homo homini lupus, as Thomas Hobbes, 17th century philosopher, put it. I'm coming to the end. The negation of nature and of the conditions of human existence are interpreted as liberation and progress. But this progress turns out to be a progression into a totalitarian culture of death. The transformation of human rights, derived from human nature and Christian anthropology, into arbitrary, limited rights of the individual, is a Gnostic heresy of the present moment of history. I wish and pray that this initiative overcomes this severe aberration into wrong thinking and doing to restore marriage and family and the peoples of our countries. Thank you very much for your attention.